Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Corpse Club. I'm Daily Dead senior contributor James Doherty, and this week's episode of the podcast is dedicated to George Romero's The Crazies, which recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. The Crazies tells the story of the residents of a small Pennsylvania town who start to become uncontrollably violent. The military quickly descends upon the town to seemingly keep things under control. However, it transpires that the townsfolk have turned homicidal after they've come into contact with a bioweapon that has accidentally been released into the main water supply. Whilst people are rounded up and placed in quarantine, a small group escape and hide whilst figuring out what is going on. A race against time begins to either stop the spread of the outbreak or find a cure. But the situation turns dire when it becomes hard to tell who is infected and who isn't. The Crazies has now achieved a cult status. And much like most of George Romero's work, people have spoken and written about the various themes, representations and allegories that could be interpreted from the film, from the Vietnam War to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. During this podcast, I will talk to Richard France, who played Dr. Watts, about his time making the movie and his relationship with George Romero, as well as academics Professor Tony Williams and Assistant Professor Danielle Denardo about the varied interpretations of the film. The Crazies was Romero's fourth movie, coming some 5 years after Night of the Living Dead, and there are some similarities between the two. Both featured many scenes shot in Evans City, both deal with some sort of outbreak, and both feature Richard France, although Richard's casting in Night of the Living Dead came when he was getting to know his new neighbours. Here's Richard France with the full story.
Well, what happened was this. I met my late wife, Rachel, when we were both students at the Yale Drama School. She was there as a designer, I was there as a playwright. We moved to Pittsburgh in 1968 so I could get a PhD. In fact, she followed me through the program. We get to Pittsburgh, and we moved into a row of townhouses. I was offered a fellowship at Carnegie Mellon University, so we moved into this row of townhouses in a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, having no idea who our neighbors were. For the better part of a week, we didn't have any contact with them. And then one day, it was a Saturday actually, they knocked on the door and they said to us, "Would you guys like to be in a movie?" And it turns out these guys, most of these guys, were investors in Night of the Living Dead. And the movie they were talking about was that. And George was shooting that up around Evans City just north of Pittsburgh. So we thought, to be neighborly, what the hell, why not? But what happened was I got stuck in front of a car with a bone, some white makeup thrown on my face, and I was told to chew on the bone. That's it.
After Richard's bone-jumping time on Night of the Living Dead, he returned to his day job. But some years later, he would appear again in one of George Romero's films. But this time, his casting wasn't based on who he lived next door to.
I was not only doing the work at Carnegie Mellon, but I got a job at the public television station there in Pittsburgh, WQED, to be what they called, euphemistically, their cultural affairs editor. And that meant every week I did a story on some kind of cultural activity in Pittsburgh, a play opening, a movie, etc. George, it turned out, I didn't really meet him on that set that night at up in Evans City. He was just running around. He shot and he shot and he shot, and that was it. But it turns out he was a fan of the news show that I was on. Somebody pointed out to him that, yeah, he did that bit up at Evans City, and he's here in getting his PhD. And George said, aha. First of all, he liked my voice, which was a lot better in those days. And he also got a big, big kick out of the idea that the scientist in his film actually have a PhD, even though my PhD has nothing whatsoever to do with science.
Initially, Richard was cast in a supporting role in There's Always Vanilla, but he had a much larger role 2 years later as Dr. Watts, the scientist tasked with trying to find an antidote in The Crazies. Many of Richard's scenes were with actor Lloyd Holler, who played General Peckham. but Richard only met Lloyd after the movie was released.
What was interesting about those scenes were that Lloyd wasn't there. I had no contact with him on the Crazies, on the set. It was George would read his lines, and so I assumed that when he came, George would read my lines, and he would. What happened was, one day I'm in New York, and I'm in Greenwich Village, and I'm walking one day down whatever street it was, and this very handsome black man is walking towards me, and he points at me and he says, "I know you." I had no idea who Lloyd was. I mean, and I said, "Okay," and he introduced himself, and that's how I met Lloyd Holler, and on a street corner, on a street in Greenwich Village, and we went off and had coffee, and we talked and had a lovely hour or two together. And he went his way and I went my way. That's the only contact they ever had with Lloyd Holler.
Lloyd Holler wasn't the only person who Richard didn't meet. He also never met actors Lane Carroll, Will Macmillan, Harold Wayne Jones, Richard Liberty, or Lynn Lowry, who played the group trying to dodge the military. Although he did meet the actor who was originally due to play Will Macmillan's character of David. But he seemed to be confused about what a camera was primarily used for.
In the Crazies, don't forget, I had no contact whatsoever with the leads in that film. My scenes were shot very independently of the scenes that featured those folks. I will tell you one thing, though. One thing I do remember. I'm in my laboratory with my assistant, who, by the way, was the wife of the producer. I'm in my laboratory, and one day a guy shows up, and apparently he was the original male lead of the film, and he just showed up. And so what he did was he did something really stupid. He stood in front of the camera and started combing his hair, looking into the camera. And I thought to myself, number one, the camera's not a mirror. Number two, what the hell are you doing here? You know, it just the arrogance of it all. Wasn't that long after that Will replaced him. So Will was actually a replacement for this guy who was in love with himself.
Despite having an odd experience with the original lead, Richard never had any similar experiences with George, who was extremely casual when directing.
There were no long discourses on what you should think or any of that sort of thing. He puts you in a place. He set up the camera. Basically, you took your seat like in the laboratory, okay? In the scenes, the lab scenes in Crazies. He set us up, my assistant and me, and then he moved the camera to where he wanted us, and that was basically just if he liked the way it came out, he kept that shot, that scene, that take rather. If he didn't, he did another one. I don't recall there being more than 2 or 3 takes of any of those scenes rather. And he was a joy to work with. I mean, really a wonderful pleasure to work with.
If anything, it appeared that George just wanted to make sure he and the people around him were having fun.
Orson Welles, when he made Citizen Kane, a very famous cinematographer by the name of Greg Tolan came to him and said, "I want to shoot your movie." And he's the man who shot a lot of John Ford's movies. He was one of the most acclaimed cinematographers in Hollywood. And Wells said to him, "Why? I've never made a movie." And Tolan said to him, "That's precisely the reason. You don't know what you can't do. You know, your imagination is free." So Wells made up things on the spot. And Tolan's job was to figure out how to do them, how to realize them. That was sort of the attitude in a George film. I don't know what can't be done, so let's try it. And that was the fun of it. And that's what made it so delightful working with George. He enjoyed what he was doing. And he enjoyed the fact that we were enjoying it. I don't recall anybody who worked on those films early on who had anything really bad to say about the experience. If they did, that'd be news to me. George set the tone, and the tone for him was let's just do this. Okay, let's have a good time doing this. You know, no matter how gory it might be, no matter what you want to read into it later, let's do the damn thing and have fun.
After filming had completed and the movie was released, Richard's next interaction with the Crazies was when the movie aired on TV, and Richard may have had fun making the movie, but it appears his daughters didn't have a fun time watching it.
The only contact with actually seeing the film I ever had was several years later. My wife and I had moved from, Rachel and I had moved from Pittsburgh to back to New York, actually. And our younger daughter, our two daughters, were having friends over because Crazies was on television. They were very young, and Miriam, the younger of the two, was like 5 years old, and she saw her father get killed, and it absolutely blew her mind. She thought truly that's what had happened. So Rachel had to bring her upstairs so I could console her, and it took a lot of consoling, I must say, because she really thought, having seen that blood and all of that her father was dead, and so I had to talk her out of it.
His role in the Crazies meant that Richard was recognised by other filmmakers who wanted to cast him in their movies, but it was voiceover work that Richard desired, and he managed to get that with the help of George Romero.
I did get offers, interestingly enough, to make several other films based upon a performance that I always thought of was kind of J. Worthington Ham performance. I was over, my God, it was like I was playing to the second balcony, if I recall correctly. When I was working with Lloyd, I was pontificating, and in retrospect, I'm glad I didn't see it. It would have chilled my bones. But yes, that did. But the more important than that, however, and I wasn't a union member. George, when he cast me on those on Crazies, and especially on Dawn of the Dead, had to put up escrow money for me, with the unions, meaning that arguing that he couldn't find anybody else for the role, so he hired me. And so he had to put up this escrow money. So when I came back to New York, I got into voiceovers, and I really enjoyed doing that work. But if it hadn't been for George, I could never have done it at the level I did it. That money, by being there, meant I could join the union. And George made that possible for me. Okay. And for years, I had a good and lucrative career. And I think that's George's doing. If it hadn't been for that one gesture he did, he made that possible. And I've always been grateful to him for that.
Richard would later go on to work with George again on Dawn of the Dead, this time as the eye patch-wearing doctor who suggests that nuclear bombs should be dropped on all large cities. And even though Richard was due to be paid for his role, he declined in order to help George.
When we finished, George said goodbye, and what happened was I found out he was ill. One of his organs was bad, and he was in pretty bad shape for a while. So what I did was I took the contract for Dawn of the Dead, tore it up, sent it back to him, and said something to the effect that this is one bill you don't have to worry about, so forget it. Got a lovely note back from him, and that was the last time I ever saw George, which is too bad because we were really quite friendly at one point.
And even though the pair didn't have much contact after Dawn of the Dead in 1978, Richard still has fond memories of George.
I just want to remember George as the George I knew, who was a delight to work with, a great sense of humor, generous, kind, and I'm not making this up. I'm not into the usual Hollywood bullshit. I mean, he really was a lovely, lovely guy. The guy I knew and the guy I relished working with. The freedom he gave me was quite astonishing, actually, because, and maybe he liked the idea or understood right instinctively that he had a gruff, the sardonic personality he was dealing with, so he didn't have to direct that. That's the kind of role I was playing. He cast me so much to type, for God's sake.
Now, much has been made of the social commentaries in Romero's films, but Richard doesn't recall being told about themes or allegories when being directed by George.
George's directions, at least to me, were not discourses on socio-political issues. Okay, there's no question George had a strong social conscience. All right, look at the films. The very nature of the way he cast, for example, the four leads, beginning with Night of the Living Dead, There's always a quartet, and it's always headed up by a strong black character who takes the lead. That was rather revolutionary casting in those days. I mean, casting a black man or a black anybody as the focal point of the film, really. I mean, as Dwayne was in Night of the Living Dead, and all of these guys are really the force to be reckoned with in these films. George, insofar as coming up as a scholar, now insofar as him instructing me anyway on what the back story might be to the scene of the character, etc. No, there was never any of that. Nothing like that, as a matter of fact. There was basically, I honestly don't recall ever getting an instruction from him that had to do with anything like that. Everything that I can remember had to do with, mind you, this is 50 years ago, had to do with something going wrong technically, or he wanted another take, or that sort of thing. And even that, there was very little of.
One person who has expressed views about Romero's work is Tony Williams, a professor at Southern Illinois University. Tony teaches film and is the author of The Cinema of George Romero, Night of the Living Dead. That's Night with a K. Tony has written extensively about George Romero's films, and his interest goes back nearly 50 years.
Well, it went back to Warwick University back in 1976 to 77 when Robin Wood was teaching film there. And for my MA topic, he suggested doing the family in the American horror film and the Western. And we'd already seen Night of the Living Dead in England. And it wasn't until I was invited to the Toronto Film Festival, where they had a special segment on the horror film, that I got to see George's other films, such as Jack's Wife and The Crazies, which were not available in England. I met him in Pittsburgh. After seeing him at the Toronto Film Festival, I actually went over, and he and his colleagues made me very welcome in the Latent Image building in Pittsburgh. And he or somebody else showed me the cellar, which was used in Night of the Living Dead. I was given directions to the Monroeville Mall by Michael Gornick, who was the director of photography on the film, and everybody was so hospitable when I was there.
According to Tony Williams, George wanted to explore creating other non-zombie horror films between night and dawn. And even though George is remembered for revolutionising the zombie genre, he's so much more than a director of zombie films.
The Crazies ranks within that independent period between Night and before Martin. And it was a time in which George didn't want to be stereotyped as a zombie horror film director. He wanted to branch off in other areas, but unfortunately, these films were not commercially successful, so he ended up doing a very good sequel to Night called Dawn. But George is not a zombie film director at all. He is very much similar to what was once said about Orson Welles as an independent film director who happened to work in Hollywood, and George is an independent American director who just happened to be attached to the modern American horror film, which he gave some very individual interpretations to.
And The Crazies proves that George is not just a zombie director. And upon his first viewing, Tony Williams believed there was an allegorical association with the Vietnam War.
In the Toronto Film Festival viewing, one saw some distinctive elements of Night, but the film was very rapidly edited, and it had an allegorical association because many American and European genre films dealt with the Vietnam War in an indirect manner. So apart from the Green Beret, no studio during the time of the Vietnam War would touch the subject, but it became an interesting area of exploration in several horror films at the time. And there were Vietnam veterans like Mark Walker in his book on Vietnam cinema who saw the Vietnam connection, as did many other people.
And in his book about the films of George Romero, Tony Williams states that The Crazies is an allegorical critique of America's Vietnam syndrome.
It's an explicit denial, but it's an implicit. If you look at the film very carefully, you can see all these critiques, as well as the fact that it anticipates what we now know, those of us who have not eyes wide shut, of the nastiness of the American government and the military. And one reason why George cut it very rapidly was that the scenes would be there for a blink of an eye, then they would go, like the American troops looting the dead bodies of the plague victims before they throw them onto the fire.
George Romero has previously said that The Crazies was more of an anti-military film, and this is something that can still be seen today.
There's a particular Vietnam War allegorical association, but the more you look at it now, it is certainly definitely anti-military against a group which has since been revered in mainstream Hollywood productions.
One of the amazing things about the movies of George Romero is the ability to see different meanings in them, even if it wasn't what the director had intended to convey. As The Crazies deals with how a virus breaks out and spreads, coupled with the fact that authorities in charge are underprepared to deal with the situation, it is easy to draw parallels with the recent COVID-19 pandemic. The Crazies hits home a little differently since 2020. There were even news stories during the pandemic about how those who watched zombie and apocalypse movies showed more resilience and less anxiety. One person who is no stranger to zombie apocalypse movies is Danielle Denardo, who is an assistant professor in sociology at Sociology University in California. One of Danielle's research areas focuses on health disparities, and she has used zombie films to make her students think more critically about the COVID-19 pandemic.
What I found is that zombie films have, worked well for encouraging students to think critically about the COVID-19 pandemic, because zombie apocalypse films kind of can serve as a hypothetical kind of pandemic case, right? They're fictional, but they represent, they're supposed to depict some type of pandemic event. And so I can use that and have students analyze them in thinking about them as a hypothetical kind of pandemic scenario to compare the COVID-19 pandemic to. And so by critically examining similarities and differences between the film and the actual COVID-19 pandemic, students are able to kind of gain a deeper understanding of COVID-19 and particularly the relationship between pandemics and inequalities. And so I found that that's been a helpful kind of teaching tool, is to use zombie apocalypse films. And so I've been able to kind of publish and talk about that, using that as a teaching tool.
And can The Crazies be interpreted as a zombie film?
Oh, definitely. Yes. I think it works as a kind of a non-traditional zombie film of sorts, but it's definitely a pandemic film. Yes.
And after watching The Crazies, Danielle Denardo noticed that the film displayed the concept of elite panic. Here's Danielle to explain further.
Elite panic is a concept that has been discussed in sociological disaster research. And really the basic idea behind the concept is that there's a common belief that people are naturally prone to panic in times of crisis. And this idea that people are just naturally that way is actually more of a myth based on the research that we have. And in fact, it's actually institutional elites and authorities, particularly those who hold emergency powers, right, who create this panicked behavior in the public. And so how this works is that the institutional elites, like we're thinking about government or political leaders, right, they fear social disorder and challenges to their legitimacy and believe that this will happen automatically. So they buy into the myth that the majority of the population is, when a disaster strikes, is going to be out of control and make decisions and produce orders based on this myth, because they have this irrational fear and their primary concern for maintaining control and maintaining power. So they make decisions and produce orders based on this. And so this actually kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the actions that they've taken to control people, like withholding information or forcibly removing people from their homes, actually encourages responses that we might label as non-compliant or panicked, right? So it actually kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but they could interpret it as, well, this is just how people naturally are. And so as disaster researchers have pointed out, the media has often encouraged this kind of myth about, panic, by focusing on how, on people panicking and being selfish during disasters. And we're talking about like both real disasters, but also fictional stories like disaster films. What's interesting is that the Crazies challenges this more than other films, especially for that time period, because it's really focusing more on showing how the decisions that are being made by people in power, particularly in this case, the military leaders, right, are based on the assumption of rioting and an out of control townspeople, and that this actually shaped their entire plan to deal with the crisis. So what we see in the film is the officials withholding information, critical information from the community out of fear that they're going to just, freak out, and then forcibly removing people from their homes and putting them all together in a tiny high school gym. And shockingly, panic ensues, right? And so this is the whole idea behind kind of elite panic. And I think one woman's response in the film kind of captures this well. She's being dragged out of her home and she says, "Tell me what this is all about and maybe I'll cooperate with you," right? I mean, that's the whole idea behind this kind of elite panic. And not to mention how, right, the elites in the film actually created the very chaos they fear by creating the bioweapon called Trixie, right? That's the cause of this crisis, because the bioweapon is designed to affect people's cognitive processes in a way that would make people non-compliant, behave outside of social norms. So again, right, the cause of the kind of condemned behavior or behavior they fear is themselves, like the institutional elites.
And it appears rather clear that elite panic is something we saw a lot of during COVID-19.
So, I mean, in terms of elite panic, we've seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, this kind of top down, or what's been termed like a stomp down approach, has been taken in many countries. For example, like when militaries were used, to enforce lockdown or quarantine orders, that is an example of that kind of, or could be considered an example of that. And also in the US, there was, initially a downplaying of danger, especially by President Trump, that was misleading early on and created confusion. And so that could be seen as part of that.
Danielle mentioned there were two things she noticed about the Crazies. One was elite panic, and the other was stigmatization.
So stigma involves the attachment of negative beliefs and attitudes to a health condition, and the people who have that health condition or are even just perceived to have that health condition. And this often leads to stigma or to discrimination, which can include even things like violence, right? Because people are often dehumanized through stigmatization. And so we see some of this in the film because, the military leaders and government officials basically treat the people of the town as already dead once one person has been infected. And so the people of the town were effectively dehumanized and really seen again, only, by the military only as like a threat to national security and, people outside of the town. So, and they were, we saw how they're even ready to like bomb the town. And so, we see this kind of stigmatization process kind of happening. And a poignant example, I think, in the film of stigma is when the colonel describes the people who are infected. He gives the orders to the folks under him, that anyone who's infected should be treated as the enemy. Right. And so stigmatization is all about separating out us versus them, and then viewing the othered group, the them group, as a threat, or not fully human or already dead, right? And those types of things. And so I think that we can definitely see that in the film, and that's a form of, that produces inequalities and through that discrimination, just by systematically treating groups of people differently. And then also like the particular label of crazy used in the film also embodies the social stigmatization of mental illness. That's really common. And even just, neurological conditions or just people behaving outside of what is considered normal or predictable. Right. And so, and it's poignant in the film with the language that's used. So like, someone describes a home where people have been infected as a loony bin, right? People are described as lunatics. He just went crazy, right? All of that language is stigmatizing. And even the fact that the bioweapon is named Trixie is also interesting because women tend to be labeled as crazy more often than men. So using a woman's name for the bioweapon is interesting. I'm not sure that messaging was necessarily intended by the filmmaker, but it's interesting. So yeah, I definitely think that stigma, taps into, that's all about, just like elite panic, stigmatization, right, of health conditions is really rooted in fear, often irrational fear, and also just the social processes of prejudice and discrimination. And so that's all about social inequalities.
As mentioned previously, it's still refreshing to know that George Romero's films can still have such an impact, and the popularity of the Crazies is still apparent. In 2010, a remake starring Timothy Olyphant hit theatres, and in 2018, a 4K restoration Blu-ray with multiple additional features was released. People are still hungry for the Crazies. Maybe there's something in the water. Thank you to my guests for taking part, and remember to like, share and subscribe to Daily Dead and Corpse Club. I'm James Doherty, and thanks for listening.